Thank you everyone for coming. As you know, Syria had been undergoing this very strange situation, a devastating civil war that has gone on for more than a decade, and then a conflict that seemed frozen in space since 2016. And then very unexpectedly, last December, things began to unravel very quickly, and we've seen the regime seem to have collapsed. So I leaned on one of our own, Zeina Al Azmeh, to help enlighten us all about what's been going on in Syria. Zeina has done her postgraduate studies here, and she's now our very valued teaching associate, co-convener of the research group on culture and politics. And Zeina has agreed on very short notice to prepare this presentation for us. So thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much, Hazem. Thanks for the opportunity. Thank you all for coming. Today I'm going to talk about, well, I thought a little bit about how I could frame this talk, and then I decided to compare some of the findings of my PhD research, which was in 2000, well, concluded in 2020, so between 2017 and 2020. The interviews were mostly between 2017 and 2018, and use that kind of framework that came up from that research to compare what is happening now with what the intentions, I suppose, were, or the discourse of the narrative. My focus is on exiled intellectuals, and that was what my PhD's focus. So there are so many narratives within every revolution. You will find that the focus here will be on kind of writers and intellectuals and artists, which may differ from some of the other narratives. So just a quick timeline for those who aren't familiar with the context. In March of 2011, there were peaceful protests in Syria, inspired by the fall of Mubarak and Zine Ben Ali in Egypt and Tunisia as part of the Arab Spring. They were met with violence by the Assad regime, live ammunition, and by July, so a few months later, some of the military officials were defecting, which created what it was called the Free Syrian Army. It doesn't really exist anymore, but this was like the initial armed movement. The militarization of the movement began at that time. The discourse was kind of democratic, and the funding was mainly, I mean, they started with their own weapons, basically, that they took, handheld weapons that they took with them from their military positions within the official military. By 2013, we see the emergence of extremist factions, and then Syria becomes basically a battleground for a proxy war. In 2015, there was a huge turn when the Russian military decided to intervene in favor of the regime, and it altered the course of the conflict completely. Between 2016 and 2018, the war, was full-fledged war, and it resulted in really mass displacement and destruction. There was the Battle of Aleppo, there was the Battle of Eastern Ghouta, there was the chemical attack around that time. This was around the time I was doing my initial research. In 2019, we see increased Turkish military presence in the north, and then some tensions with the Kurdish forces, also in the north, one in the northeast, one in the northwest. And then between 2020 and 2023, complete economic collapse and really stalled efforts for peace at the international level until, as Hazem just described, on 8th of December, this military operation that had started only less than 2 weeks ago managed to arrive in Damascus and actually result in the fall of the regime and the fleeing of Assad to Russia. So the framework that I'm going to use is called the Right to Meaning framework. Some of you who attended my FAMES lecture, I see some faces here, might still remember it. Maybe some have read it, I don't know. But basically, in summary, the Right to Meaning framework interprets the Syrian revolution based on interviews with exiled Syrian intellectuals as not merely a quest to change the political regime, but also a struggle to reclaim meaning in various senses. So I identify meaning as linguistic meaning, meaning as essence. I will explain all of these. Meaning as significance, meaning as signification language, and then I will add a fifth one. The idea that the framework basically argues that there is a dichotomy or a perceived dichotomy between those who are entitled to meaning and those whose lives are expected as devoid of and maybe denied of meaning in all these senses, these four senses. And while in the empirical case that I examined here, this seems to refer to global inequality, the sense of loss of meaning or denial of meaning, those are their actual words, some of my interviewees, that resulted from the fact that the international community wasn't doing anything about all the violence and atrocities that were taking place in Syria, and between those whose lives are expected as worthy of meaning or deserve meaning. So the four meanings that emerged from the interviews are meaning as essence. So what are the meanings of the revolution? The essence of the revolution. Is it democratization? Is it something else? Meaning as significance. That is, usually they would talk about like the meaningless normally, or meaningless of our deaths and our lives. So there's a sense of kind of meaning as how important it is. Linguistic meaning, or meaning as signification. The ability to protect language from all the deformation that occur under censorship and conditions of dictatorship. And then existential meaning, which is really linked to agency, the ability to choose, make your own life choices and kind of design your life a la existentialists in a way that, reflects your agency and your freedom of choice. So a few quotes really briefly to illustrate what was happening during my interviews, how I came up, how these emerged, these meanings of meaning. Meaning as essence, or the meanings, or the essence of the revolution. So Burhan Ghalioun, one of my interviewees, says, owning politics is the profound essence of the revolution. It is the foundation for the transformation from a society of subjects ruled by military boot to a free people with political agency, united and aware of itself as a people. Similarly, Yassin Haj Saleh writes, dignity is owning politics. It is to be not followers but masters of ourselves. By being forced out of politics, people become slaves politically. Like the rest of humankind, Syrians are entitled to meaningful lives without oppression, which is why they named their peaceful uprising the Revolution of Dignity, Thawrat al-Karama. The second meaning is meaning as significance. This is Yassin Al Azmeh in the previous quote also. So the idea of the meaning or meaninglessness of people's lives. He says in one of, there aren't adaptations, but I've removed things because the quote is too long. I hope it still makes sense. But he says, when our struggle is approached through the war on terror framework, we move from the deprivation of our meaning to the permissibility of our slaughter, and from the deprivation of justice to the deprivation of life. That is genocide. In a different article, he writes, our cause today is here in an unsettled space between the denial of our meaning and the tragic hope to change the world in order for us to have meaning. And finally, he says, in the same article, we are the proletariat of meaning, the pariahs of meaning, end of quotes. Then you have linguistic meaning. Just to illustrate it, I will use, it's self-explanatory really, but I will use a quote from this interviewee, Mohammed Lattar, who's a dramaturg. He works in theater and writes, columns and other things. He says, the revolution freed language, both in its physical character as sound when people started collectively screaming out previously unspeakable during protests, and its communicative potential when protesters deconstructed the symbols of power through sarcasm, language, and language play. This is Ziad Kulthum, a filmmaker. He said, spoken language, this is from our interview in 2018, he said, spoken language among members of society had become so barren. Empty language produces hollow lives. When words are systematically emptied of their meaning through censorship and repression, social life is reduced to passive and shallow entertainment. The fourth type of meaning that emerged from these earlier interviews is existential meaning, basically the pursuit of purpose and the sense of agency. Burhan Ghalioun, who's a sociologist, in our interview says, before the revolution, nothing had meaning in Syria except aman. Aman is Arabic for security, but it's also used for the security forces, the security police. So it has this kind of dual meaning. So he says, aman in the sense of oppression, not in the sense of safety and security. Nothing had meaning, not art, not freedom, nor social relations. Meaning was crushed under the oppressive force of the security apparatus, the mukhabarat, about which people obsessed. Another quote from Daher Aita, a columnist and novelist who now lives in Germany. He told me, I think it was a revolution of existence. Many of us have personally experienced this. The oppressive powers and their agents spread everywhere could at any moment, while you go about your life in all your glory, confidence, and beautiful sense of self, take all that away from you and thrust you back into the idea that you are only living here because we are allowing it. Fast forward to 2025. I believe everyone knows what happened in reality, but the question remains, has the revolution of meaning, the revolution in the sense, because every revolution is many revolutions, but has the revolution of meaning in the sense that is kind of construed by these intellectuals succeeded? Where is it at now? And by presenting what is happening now, the key discourses, the key question, the key struggles, the key issues and concerns, I hope to kind of give you all an overview of what's happening, but also to revisit the degree to which we can say that as framed by this civil current, these intellectuals, where is the revolution at? To what extent has it actually succeeded? Yes, the regime has fallen, but is that enough to say that a revolution has succeeded? I start with meaning as essence, just to remind you the meanings of the revolution, the essence of the revolution. Something huge happened on this December 8th and the following weeks was that there was a bridging of the revolutionary narratives. Since 2011, increasingly, there was a split between what we call the civil current and the Islamist militants. And those have had very different narratives about what this revolution was about, what it aimed to achieve. But then when HTS, which is Hayat Tahrir Sham, the main faction, the operation was carried out by a huge number of factions, but the main one, the biggest number, and the leading one was Hayat Tahrir Sham. And their leader at the time, came to the public view with statements that kind of bridged with the narratives of the civil current. So this is the end of the oppression of the regime. The Syrian people have, achieved the fall of the regime. This is a continuation of what happened in 2011. They framed it as part of this emancipatory discourse that came out in 2011, rather than some of the much more sectarian or jihadist narratives that came from many of these factions, which was surprising to some people, but it certainly had the impact of kind of bridging those narratives for the first time. This resulted in the weakening of competing narratives like, for example, the regime and its allies, Russia, Iran, etc., the narrative that this was a Western conspiracy or that this was an Islamist insurgency. You'll see these narratives playing out in different ways in different regime media and some of its allies, or even with the Western media, where kind of the emancipatory element or dimension that you will see very strongly in the civil current activists and intellectuals was drowned by kind of geopolitical analyses or the idea of it's a sectarian Islamist movement also. Thirdly, there is some alignment with academic discourse. It's not 100%, but there was an important interview, I thought, with Asif Bayat, which was published earlier this month, where he construes the military operation as a major milestone, even potentially the final chapter in the delayed Syrian revolution. He uses that term, which creates this kind of cohesive identity for the revolutionary forces which didn't exist until December 2025. So the emancipatory essence of the revolution has been enforced by all this messaging, this framing, and in a sense, meaning as essence has been reclaimed. The essence of the revolution as an emancipatory political event has been reinstated after there was more doubt being cast about the nature of the event. A few quotes from, so this is Burhan Ghaliun in an interview he made on the 26th of December, so shortly after the fall of the regime. If you follow, I mean, I've been following everything obsessively, but if you follow, there is a change in the tone. This was at a phase when many had a very optimistic discourse, at least a lot more optimistic than I've seen in the past week or so. He says, today we are witnessing the return of a people, the return of their aspirations, their demands for rights, and their self-organization to fulfill themselves as a people. It is a new phase, a phase of returning to the public sphere and affirming that they are Syria. They are the foundation of a country, and they are the ones who will build it. In the interview I mentioned with Asif Bayat, who is, by the way, Iranian, not Syrian, for those who don't know him, but I think the bridging of these kind of academic discourses on people who study the Arab Spring with the narratives of the revolution has been useful. He says the recent developments in Syria represent a new form of political change, the characteristics of which will be better understood in the future. And then he continues to say, I think that the situation in Syria today is, in a complex way, a continuation of the revolutionary uprising that began in 2011. The second type of meaning is meaning as significance. And just to remind you, it's this idea of the meaning or meaninglessness of people's deaths and lives, those who died within these events. Honoring the dead was not possible. Well, the dead on the revolutionary side was not possible until, I mean, many people couldn't even hold funerals for their children who died under torture or in other ways. So now official narratives acknowledge the sacrifices of the millions of Syrians who died or were detained and tortured, and some of whom were killed by torture or were forcibly disappeared. Huge numbers, or displaced even, or those who suffered other brutal fates. And there haven't been institutionalized commemorative events yet, but there's some certainty that this will come. And there's a lot of conversation about, how Sidnaya prison is going to be turned into a type of Holocaust museum or something, or there's almost a certainty that that narrative that had been impossible, those kids who died, or older people, but those people who died in the name of the revolution were not allowed to be mourned. They were portrayed as traitors or terrorists or whatnot, and now this is different. So there's some reclaiming of meaning as significance, the significance of those dead at least. There's some acknowledgement of heroism, the fall of the regime and the narrated success of the revolution reclaimed the significance of people's suffering and their deaths, and they were no longer seen as meaningless, as many of the families of those who died complained about or even suffered about. The third way in which meaning as significance could be claimed is by kind of moving towards transitional justice, holding people accountable for war crimes and making sure that this process is done in an institutional way within legal frameworks rather than personal initiative and revengeful and, that would repeat the cycle of violence. And there is some concern around this area. For some reason, the new, I don't know what to call it, de facto leadership has not taken serious steps in the directions. The families of the forcibly disappeared have not yet been met, except for the American journalist. His mother was met, but the Syrian mothers and families have not been addressed or met with, despite several requests. There have been no serious kind of planning or announcements about what the process is going to be. There have been several protests at the community level demanding even a ministry for transitional justice or some really serious effort at the institutional and government level to address how this will how accountability will look like and how long it will take and who's going to carry out. Is it with international organizations? Is it within the country, etc.? All of this makes it very difficult to control violence, really. There have been some incidents, not out of control, I would say, until now, but there have been some very concerning incidents of revenge, violence or killing or brutalization. Unfortunately, in the absence of a promise of accountability, they take sometimes sectarian forms, sometimes they address the right victims. Yeah, I mean, the right perpetrators and who become victims, but sometimes they don't. And to support the idea about what the concerns are around this recapturing of meaning as significance, this is a quote from Ali Atassi, who's a filmmaker. He says, "Revolutionaries who gave their lives remind us that freedom is costly but not unattainable. Their stories define the transition, giving meaning to every step toward a liberated Syria." Novelist Rosa Yassin Hassan writes in a social media post, "I've lost many friends who disappeared or were killed in detention. My heart has been broken countless times, but I always got back up again. For those who are gone, for our children, for tomorrow, for this country, and for the dream of freedom, it would be a great betrayal if we were to lose ourselves in hatred and darkness and forget the core dream, a free, dignified, democratic, united, diverse, compassionate, inclusive, and healthy nation." There have been challenges to justice. This is Mohammed Abdullah, who is the executive director of the Syrian Justice and Accountability Center. He describes how, there are many challenges towards justice. Hundreds upon hundreds of rooms, stretching as far as the eye can see, he says, are filled with documents from floor to ceiling. Even if our efforts continued for 6 more months, we wouldn't cover 1% of the available materials. In addition to this, he talks about the lack of comprehensive protections. For some of you who follow have seen how, there was this NGO initiative of sorts to paint beautiful murals on top of the walls of some of the cells, which contain incredible evidence about, who was there. And so there's really lack of attention and action towards preserving evidence, towards collecting and organizing all these files from the security service branches. And, there's obviously, as a result, a risk that evidence will be lost through looting, destruction, or mere neglect. Yassin al-Haj Saleh, whose wife was forcibly disappeared back in 2013, has been a champion of this cause. He's been very vocal about it. He said, "The forcibly disappeared are denied both life and the right to be mourned. Understanding their fate is not only a matter of transitional justice, it's a national responsibility and an essential step for Syria's healing. There cannot be national mourning without first achieving justice and knowing the full truth about their fate." And just to wrap up here, in not the entire presentation, but this section about meaning, what are the urgent questions that still circulating around the question of meaning as significance? Most of the interactions, I should have said this earlier, I'm using social media and anecdotal data to collect. I have not been able to go back to Syria, so this is all collected through publications, document analysis, social media posts, and some anecdotal data that is coming from people who are visiting and telling me their encounters. So some of the questions are, how can those who committed crimes against Syrians be prosecuted in ways that ensure justice and accountability for all crimes while avoiding cycles of retribution? How will efforts to uncover the fate of the disappeared be managed, and what frameworks can ensure acknowledgement and answers for families? What national transitional justice institution will be established? Maybe a ministry or something else, and how can they balance accountability with reconciliation? And what is the role of the United Nations and other international institutions in shaping and overseeing the transitional justice process? Third, I will move to meaning as signification, linguistic meaning. There is a lot of concern in this area because there is a lot of concern for freedom of speech if we don't transition to democracy in a healthy way, which, although it was kind of announced early on, the de facto government did say, well, the de facto leadership and its interim government did say that, you know, there would be elections within 3 years. In the meantime, there needs to be a huge census just to know, you know, to get information about, you know, who the electorate is, where they are, and give numbers, etc. But also to resolve more urgent issues like faction fighting and, you know, regaining sovereignty on the entirety of the Syrian geography and other priorities. But also, very importantly, to rewrite the constitution, which, if it is going to be an inclusive process, as they have announced, will take time, because how do you ensure this representation, and, you know, in what processes? And there's a huge debate about, you know, reducing representation to sectarian representation or ethnic representation versus actually thinking of different political views, different political parties, you know, not reducing components to ethnic and religious or sectarian components, but intellectual and political components. And that's one of the huge areas of friction at the moment. So meaning as signification cannot be restored without fostering an environment where diverse viewpoints, including those misaligned with traditional norms and religious doctrine, can be expressed relatively safely. This is also not just about free speech. It also entails reclaiming language from distortions that are not intentional, but that are caused by decades of censorship. Because what happened, I mean, I wrote more extensively about this, but maybe I can summarize. Words, I mean, we came across the word emin earlier. You know, emin is supposed to mean security. It became security forces, you know, that it lost that meaning. But even words like ishtirakiya, which means socialism, really is used to describe what is in fact a crony capitalist system. The word, you know, there are so many ways in which language was deformed over the years so that words lost their honest, real meaning. Lisa Wedeen talks about this, describes this as a politics of as if, and I like that expression because people know, but they pretend that they don't know. That's kind of the idea. So when they use those words, for example, performing loyalty to the regime, there is good evidence that they already know they don't mean these things, but they have to do them. So I know that this isn't, you know, that the regime is oppressive, but I act as if I don't know, or as if it isn't. And that is continuing to some extent, I think, with the current situation. There's a tendency still, I don't think these things get erased very quickly. You know, they take generations and a lot of cultural and legal and educational work to counter. But you will see some of this politics as if manifesting in new ways with the new authorities, temporary as they may or may not be. And then there's the idea that reclaiming linguistic meaning will require the dismantling of this politics as if, as well as acknowledging Syria's diversity culturally. I mean, there was always an insistence on the national. There was no acknowledgement of the different components and languages within Syria. Kurdish was actually elite. You were not allowed to use Kurdish if that was your family's language. So there's also work to be done in terms of reclaiming language that reflects, and not only reflects, but nurtures and celebrates Syria's cultural and ethnic diversity and linguistic diversity. A few quotes from from the participants of the first study who are now publishing other stuff. Samar Yazbek writes in a media interview in a French newspaper, "The language of freedom was forged in blood. Preserving it is a duty. Distorting it would betray those who fell defending it. Democracy cannot be reduced to slogans. It must be lived, practiced, and protected from falling into old patterns of authoritarian control." Standing in front of you might have seen this in the poster also, this is Majlis Square, where the families of the forcibly disappeared are hanging all of their children's or family members' data, not pictures and information, hoping to find. A lot of those of you who follow will see that a lot of those who were released from prisons were not mentally, or their memories were not intact. And so there's a lot of people who are believed to be out there, but their families can't find them. Samar writes, the regime did not only oppress bodies, but also imprisoned words. It turned the language of resistance into whispers, forcing us to redefine what it means to speak freely. To rebuild our country, we must also rebuild how we talk to one another. Lama Tayyara, who is an academic and a literary critic, says, even when I wrote cultural or artistic articles, I did so under extreme caution, as if the gatekeeper sat above my head. Today, fear has taken a different shape. With calls to abolish the Ministry of Culture and its activities, culture is an urgent necessity and priority for this phase. It is not something that can be postponed to a later stage. Abdallah Al-Kafri, who's a playwright and academic, teaches in Lebanon and also a cultural activist, says, the challenge lies in culturally enabling Syria's ethnic, linguistic, and cultural diversity. How can we move beyond a protective approach, that is protections of the minorities that you will hear a lot in the Western media, to one that actively tests and fosters coexistence. This shift must be grounded in constitutional and legal guarantees within a framework of citizenship that rediscovers and embraces the richness and complexity of Syrian society. So the urgent questions that are around this idea of linguistic meaning: how will the constitutional process be shaped and by what teams to ensure freedom of expression and the right to articulate political dissent? How will the inclusive National Dialogue Conference, which was promised but has not yet been delivered, how will it address the suppression and reclamation of political discourse? What mechanisms will be established to protect diverse linguistic, cultural, and political expressions in the new Syrian state? And will women's active participation in constitutional drafting ensure there is more inclusive and representative discourse among Syrians? The fourth type of meaning that was observed in the initial study that was being reclaimed or fought for is existential meaning, the fundamental human pursuit of purpose and agency grounded in the capacity to shape one's own life, one's own conditions and environment. So some of the ideas that are circulating right now around this concept. One is establishing a social contract that is grounded in citizenship and equality. Usually it is presented as opposed to in kind of guarantees for minorities. Such a social contract is essential for enabling lives with agency and purpose. There's concern about the degree to which there has been or will continue to be sufficient progress towards democracy. So a constitution that is inclusive of Syria's diverse beliefs and lifestyles and life choices, overcoming challenges such as authoritarian influences within the current leadership. I mean, some of you might know that the head of the HTS, the faction that is now the de facto kind of in control, used to be the governor or leader of the Idlib province, which was outside the control of the regime. And it was a pretty conservative Islamist setup, which isn't exactly admired for its protection of freedoms. And so there's a lot of concern around whether, how much control will this group be able to retain long-term and maybe even capture power, and to what extent will the current leadership, combined with external interferences from very competing international actors, Iran, Turkey, the US, and others, to what extent will these interferences and the authoritarian influence of the current de facto leadership change the focus on citizenship and rights to a focus on minority protections or minority guarantees that reproduces kind of a sectarian structure within society and politics in Syria? And then women's rights. Women face enduring. I mean, it hasn't been great for women in Syria for a long time. Post-war challenges have exacerbated the situation. Combined with the pressures of a theocratic state, there is serious concern that there will be further setbacks unless gender equalities become kind of a priority within the political discourse and the evolving political landscape. And maybe in the discussion, if you like, we can talk a little bit about what's been happening. In this vein, actually, yesterday, the 27th of January, I just managed to add this slide now, which is a very interesting article by Zeina Al Azmeh, who talks about, she brings back the memory in 1981, a group of parachuters, like military women, came into the city and started force pulling off the hijabs from women who were wearing the hijab, and using violent language and violent acts. There was a lot of violence that resulted from this. And 2 days ago, no, maybe a week ago, in public transport, there were posters about the appropriate dress for women, with pictures of very veiled women, not veiled, like completely covered women. And of course, they were countered by so many posters, some of them quite witty, from civil society and different independent actors about appropriate. This is one appropriate dress for the free women. And then it talks about that you choose it, that nobody forces it on you, da da da. And then there was one on Batman, and that the mask doesn't fall off. It became a joke, which I think is really healthy, that people are responding to these attempts. It's not clear who is initiating these attempts. The government, the interim government, and the de facto leadership are claiming that those are individual initiatives, like they're not responsible for them. But the environment is one where that has become possible, whereas before it was not. So Samad, coming back to her article, she is contrasting this event, telling women what to wear now, with the event in 1981, telling women what not to wear, the hijab then, and kind of equating them and discussing how women's bodies have become the battleground between two seemingly opposing forces, but they're actually essentially the same. They share the desire to, dominate and control women's bodies. And both groups converge on a single point, which is the elimination of individual and personal freedoms for Syrians. And this struggle, she says, is not just about the hijab or the niqab. It is about establishing clear societal stance, rejecting silence and intensifying activism that refuses to infringe upon personal freedoms. Rights must be protected for all men, women alike, and enshrined in the Constitution. Speaking of the Constitution, Ali Al-Attasi he's a filmmaker and writer, and he published a very interesting article about the Constitution challenging the de facto government's decision or announcement that they would appoint a constitutional committee, and insisting that this needs to be a representative process that's done through some kind of, either election or some kind of representative process, just to ensure, because if they appoint them, there's obviously, it's predictable what kind of legal experts are going to be on this committee and what kind of constitution the country would end up with. Aziz Al Azmeh, who's a lot more critical of, Yassin Haj Saleh, who you saw earlier, calls him a secular jihadist. So, because he's so, he's so secularist that it's almost a form of, he says, the culture of Syria's political and legal framework developed over a century has been overshadowed by sectarian and theocratic tendency. HTS, which is the faction that led the operation and is now in control, HTS actions reflect a Salafi-rooted vision of a state, issuing executive decisions rather than laws based on legitimacy. Their envisioned army resembles militias. He is referring here to recent promotions in the army that included non-Syrian jihadists. There are 120,000 fighters that came into Syria that are not Syrian. And he, for example, argues that they need to be sent back immediately, and by contrast, the new leadership has promoted some of them, nationalized them, and put them in the military. So this is why he's saying, the army is even taking the shape of a militia. Islamization in Syria, he says, has occurred to great degrees, often defensively, for solace in harsh conditions. But as for freedoms, their jurisprudential definition in Islam, he argues, is not to be a slave. So there are very differing understanding of freedom as freedom to choose your life, your language, your versus freedom as being free from. You know, it reminds us of Arendt's kind of freedom to versus freedom from. And in the end of the article, he says, in a pessimistic tone, you cannot simply extract al-Jolani. This is the nom de guerre of Ahmad Shara, who is the leader. You cannot simply extract al-Jolani from al-Shara and toss him away. Similarly pessimistic, I would say, is Haytham Manna, who is an academic and a human rights activist. And he says in a media interview on the 24th of January, these are dark times. And then he goes on to say, I ask every Syrian to hold on to their right to hope, because if they take away this right, they will truly have defeated us. And he's very active in organizing. He's back on the stage, he's forming a party, he's doing all kinds of things. In the vein of existential meaning, Yassin Hassaleh is criticizing here kind of the discourse of protection of minorities, that is mainly coming from Western governments, but also, well, yes, mainly from Western governments. He says how callous and insensitive one must be to speak about protecting minorities, as the US Secretary of State did at the Arab Foreign Ministers Conference, and before him, the German era, when they never uttered a single word about the right of non-minorities or about citizenship and equality of citizenship in Syria. His argument has always been that, you know, the majority has been slaughtered for 14 years. Nobody seemed to object. Why is this concern with protection all of a sudden emerging, and protection only of minorities? The principle of protecting minorities does not open up to democracy, citizenship, and equality, but exclusively to special international guarantees for minorities. Related questions in this vein: when and how can all Syrians unite towards a political transition that restores dignity, freedom, and agency to everyday life? How and when can factions be dissolved and the state restore its monopoly over violence? Within the law, obviously. Will the new constitution, the new political parties and elections reflect Syria's cultural and political diversity and protect civil liberties? And how will the new military and security forces be established to ensure Syrians feel secure and free from fear? Those are kind of the themes that are circulating in the media, in social media conversations, etc. There's a fifth type of meaning that I think has now become a concern. Maybe it has been, but I hadn't captured it earlier, which is the meaning of Syria as a political society, as a political entity, you know, statehood, sovereignty, etc. There are several reasons for this concern. One of them is international occupation. So, for example, Haj Saleh characterizes al-Assad's era as a form of internal occupation, framing liberation as a dual struggle, both against domestic despotism and external domination. There are geopolitical challenges to sovereignty. There's the foreign interference by the US in support of the SDF, by Russia in you know, supporting Fulul, the remnants of the regime, by Iran, who is making concerning announcements once in a while and potentially training some of the people, pro-regime groups and military who fled to Iraq. Turkey, who really funds to a great extent, has strong influence over the HDS, which is the current de facto government. All of this undermines Syria's independence and governance capacity. Then there's the Israeli aggression, which started immediately after Bashar Assad fled Damascus. There have been over 600 airstrikes immediately after the fall of the regime, which have significantly degraded Syria's military infrastructure, weakened its territorial integrity, and exacerbated concerns about the already occupied, illegally occupied Golan Heights. More land has been grabbed from that area. And then finally, there's the Kurdish-led SDF control over vast territories in the north, which poses an additional challenge. Negotiations in this area have been promising, I must say, so far. Like, that's the one area where I'm like, yeah, maybe this will work out. But really, the SDF has control over maybe around a quarter of the Syrian geography as we speak, with ambitions of independence, but negotiations have come a long way from that. Am I okay on time? Wrap up. Yeah. So in terms of geopolitical contingency, we have the statement by the Syrian Women's Political Movement in its meeting on January 2025. They say external military interventions have fragmented our nation and undermined the possibility of a unified democratic Syria. It is imperative that the international community supports a political process led and owned by Syrians. Burhan Ghalioun, in his interview back in late December, said, "The Assad regime's rule was a profound betrayal of Syria's people, turning the country into a battlefield for external powers. Recent Israeli strikes exploited Syria's fragile state, launching 600 strikes in 8 days, targeting military infrastructure and air defense. This weakens the state, exposes it to external forces, and deepens chaos as Israel expands its occupation to the Golan Heights. Reclaiming statehood means confronting these forces while building national consensus." On the unresolved situation in the northeast with the Kurds, he says it's fundamentally about cultural and political rights. He seems in his interview to support the idea that if the Kurds are given their cultural and political rights, then that desire for independence will wane. And ensuring that these rights are within the framework of a unified Syrian state. He's against separation. Obviously, as you probably know, it's also thorny because the U.S. supports the SDF, there's lots of oil in that area, so it's more than cultural and political, I think, but it's also a thorny area that is, I think, making some progress. Faris Helou also, I think I've covered this critique of the discourse of minorities rather than the discourse of citizenship. Some of the remaining questions: how and when exactly will the promised inclusive national dialogue conference be held? It's been postponed twice so far, which is not very promising. Will it succeed in affirming Syria's collective political identity? Similar conferences didn't reap good results in the context of Sudan and Libya, as Burhan explains in his interview. And then what form will the interim government take? This is the government that will be established after supposedly the current emergency government, Tasrif Amal, just like running affairs, acting government, expires supposedly on March 1st, so quite soon. What will this interim government that will take control, how will it be formulated, what will its mandate be, and how will it define the national trajectory? And then how will the new military and security forces reflect Syria's sovereignty and independence, particularly after these recent and very controversial appointments and promotions? What are the requirements for dissolving all factions? Because not all factions have been dissolved. Many groups have refused to hand in their weapons until they see serious progress towards democratic elections. What are the requirements? Where does the Kurdish question fit within the broader narrative of Syria as a unified yet pluralistic political society? And what measures will ensure the new Syria protects citizenship rights rather than focusing narrowly on minority guarantees? So basically, what I've argued, I suppose, is that reclaiming meaning in its 4 interconnected dimensions is facing challenges in this post-Assad Syria. While meaning as essence, you could even say meaning as essence, the essence of the revolution, you could say has been achieved. There's really great consensus that this was a genuine popular movement with emancipatory aspirations. Of course, there's always complications related to geopolitical interferences and supports and powers and funding. It's an additional dimension, but that seems to be consensus that the meanings and the essence of the revolution have been restored. In terms of meaning as significance, we have some progress, but there's still the huge challenge within the lack of progress at the transitional justice level, holding people accountable for war crimes. In linguistic meaning, like I said, serious concerns about freedom of expression and continued kind of despotism if the progress towards democracy does not materialize in the way that it's been described, or maybe I could cautiously say promised. And then existential meaning, similarly, is contingent on civil liberties and freedoms, which are not, there are no clear reassurances in that area, particularly given the nature of the de facto government, its history in Idlib, its Salafist ideology, and all the rest of it. And then, with this fifth type of meaning, Syria's political meaning, there are some serious challenges now which are dependent, which make this meaning dependent on achieving sovereignty and navigating external interferences in Syria's future. So, amid all the overwhelming realities that fuel a pessimism of the intellect, there's a story behind each of these photos. I don't know if you want to get back to them, but this is the Captagon, this is the earthquake, this is the destruction. This is, ironically, the Minister of Justice captured on a video that shows him responsible for field executions of a woman for accusations of a sexual, adultery, not adultery. I think maybe sex work, but regardless, it's not. I don't see a court. And then the poverty, and then the kind of the history of the people who are now in power. Sorry. And yet, there's a lot of activism, there's a lot of kind of dialogue, discussion, conversation, challenges from the people at the ground level, so much of that it's really, and there's the freeing of the prisoners, which was just heartwarming, the return of, displaced people meeting with their families, and the activism on the ground that continues to demand without, hesitation and with a lot of force to contribute to shaping the next phase in Syria's history. Thank you so much for your attention. Shall I?
Yeah, whatever you want. So okay. Thank you very much, Zeina. Let's open it up for questions. Yeah, Ala?
Thank you so much. That was a really useful theoretical framework in general, but also really to help understand what's going on in Syria right now. So thank you. That was really a great talk. I have a question for you about these different concepts of meaning and the kind of struggles behind them. So I was thinking about linguistic meaning, and I was thinking it's almost like a chicken and egg phenomenon, because you kind of need that to shift for the other meanings to come into play. But also, it's not really safe to shift the linguistic, like to speak openly, unless you know the other ones are coming into play. So there's like there's some kind of circularity.
They're connected, absolutely.
Yeah, and sort of more broadly, I'm just wondering how you've talked about some of the dynamics behind these, but do you have a theory in this case about who you think wins in these kind of different struggles over meaning now?
Yeah, I don't have an answer to the second question. I completely agree with the first point. They are not consequential, but they depend on each other. They don't have to, people refuse to approach them consequentially. There is also that debate, even with like gender question or other, women's rights, like that's not a priority, you do that later once people have been fed. No, there's this dialogue about sequentiality, can we do these things simultaneously? Yes, we must, in my view. I think protections you're absolutely right, there is no protection of any of the other types of meaning, if you want, unless there is freedom of expression, because how do you address them if you can't even, put them into language? And that's not just about freedom of expression, it's also about kind of liberating society from really bad linguistic habits that have become entrenched over 50 years of dictatorship and extreme censorship. So there's part of it can be solved by kind of the constitution, but part of it is more about very consciously and actively resisting those habits of language that are very toxic and destructive.
Just to follow up from the same point about linguistic meanings, and don't you think it's more than corruption by dictatorship, that public intellectuals, academics, and ordinary people think about concepts through indoctrination, through a world order? So the whole contradiction or the separation between civil and Islamist or gender inequality are all concepts that have developed through a very global liberal order and imposed on everybody. So we're reproducing these. A lot of the intellectuals try and poke at them but shouldn't we think about it more as a revolution against something bigger than a dictatorship?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's absolutely, we should. I think that's what, the point that I was trying to make is that it's a revolution, if we construe it as a revolution of meaning, the way I understood it when I talked to these kind of intellectual revolutionaries, then it's much more, maybe an important and necessary milestone has been achieved with the fall of Assad, but it's far from getting to where these people aspired to get to. And I agree about kind of the conceptual apparatus that frames the way we think and the way we speak, but that can only ever be poked at, as you said, if there is the awareness that we need to do that and the possibility of using language without worry about censorship or punishment and whatnot. But yeah, great point about kind of the conceptual side of things too.
Okay. Yes, please.
I have two questions. First, you talked about the protection of ethnic minorities, and you said that it's gaining Western attention, and we will hear it from Western media especially. And I'm wondering, why do you think that this issue specifically is gaining Western attention? This is my first question. The second question is the element of truth. Many people who tried to speak up, they were described as betrayers, like Mazen Hamada, for example. But then, after that happened, the truth came up. And do you think that people knew that before, but why it was so hard to see?
Yeah, thank you. Good questions. I mean, the first one, remind me, what was the first one?
I think minorities.
The minorities, yes. The short answer, I think, in my view, is Orientalism. I think the people of the region have for a long time been reduced to their ethnic belongings that I don't think, and it's not just the Western media, by the way, it's officials. It's the delegates that have been visiting and speaking on behalf of Christians or Alawites or, and not within a concept or framework of citizenship, but in the concept and logic of let's protect the minorities. Yeah, it's been quite jarring for people inside Syria to face that, because the majority, supposed, majority, I mean, I don't want to speak in terms of majority and minority, but the supposed majority has been slaughtered, is being slaughtered for 14 years. Why, it's, yeah. So it's really a problematic discourse and it's being challenged very loudly. With regards to, did people know? I think in Syria, people knew. Every family had stories. In Syria, people knew. I think officials and politicians outside of Syria, I mean, intelligence being what it is, knew. People used different kinds of defense mechanisms to either forget or pretend, the politics of as if, and pretend that it doesn't really exist, or that, but they are actually terrorists, or they deserve, And also, I mean, the idea, Yassin Haj Saleh calls it politicide, killing politics, The idea that, that was quite a common response in Syria. But why did you get into politics? It's your, if someone, your son was detained or forced, why did they get into politics? As if, that is a separate thing that you can choose or not to get involved with. So politicides contributed to this kind of a demonization or blaming the victim logic. That people didn't know, I don't believe it. I don't believe people who say we didn't know. And there are many who are saying that now, so regime supporters who are saying, no, we didn't know. The West never claimed that they didn't know. Like, officials have long spoken about Assad as kind of a brutal dictator, but they had their own calculations that didn't make it worth,
Thank you.
Questions, David? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I thought your paper was really quite interesting, but what seemed to me that there's two approaches in it. Firstly, a cultural, liberal kind of approach in the first part of the paper, which was most of the paper, where you talked about cultural things, essentially, and about coming from the point of view of intellectuals. And then at the end, you really moved into a more political, geopolitical sort of framework. So I think my question would be, how are these two things related? what is the role of the geopolitical? I thought you were going to neglect it completely at the beginning, but you didn't, and when you came to the end, the geopolitical seemed to take a very important role. So what is the geopolitical role? What is for instance, you didn't mention sanctions, you didn't mention the material basis. Again, if one looks at countries like Afghanistan or Iraq, for instance, one has found similar sort of divisions which have come essentially from the outside, in my view, and they've not led in any way to the kinds of freedoms that your correspondents was actually talking about. So I think my question is, what, if any, is the correspondence between these geopolitical forces that you talked about at the end and the cultural kinds of objectives which you preferred, which you were arguing for in the first part of your talk? And where, if you were talking about, what some other person mentioned here, what about the population? How do they look at it? Do they look at it in geopolitical materialist terms, or are they more concerned with the kind of cultural objectives that you're talking about?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm a cultural sociologist first and foremost, so the meanings and the culture that create these things are important to me, and I claim that they are equally as important as the material. I'm the kind of cultural sociologist who doesn't agree that culture operates independently from the material. I think they feed each other very, very strongly, and I think it's cyclical. So I think both the geopolitical, the material, infrastructural, and the cultural are shaping each other in very strong ways. You're right that I spent more time talking about the cultural, but I think I don't see it as a dichotomy, because I think the geopolitical becomes part of the meanings that these people are producing. It's part of the discourse that is shaping why they want the Constitution to be rewritten in a certain way, not in another. So I think there's an interconnection between them. But yes, you're right. I don't only focus on kind of the material approach. Trying to combine the two. I don't know if I've succeeded. Maybe not.
Thank you, Zeina. It was very, very interesting and informative. I was curious about the way you sort of curated these voices, if I can use that word, because I was wondering that I think for me the big elephant in the room was the HTS itself. So how was that actually giving, sort of mediating, transforming, creating the kind of meanings that are sort of being created post Assad period? Because I think most of the people that you were referring to, I would packet them sort of in one category of more sort of liberal, academic, cultural folks together. So I would sort of expect to hear a similar kind of reverberation from that kind of chamber of voice.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Sorry, I should have made it clear in the beginning. I don't know if I did. I work on intellectuals, so that's my I'm sure there are I know that there are lots of other studies that look at more like a polling system or ways of reaching out to different audience. My work had been in 2017 to 2020 had been on exiled Syrian intellectuals and how their language, their discourses, their work interacted with the events, but also was interacted with by the general population. I didn't interview people on the ground in Syria, so I can't speak to these elements, but I agree with you. It's more important. I mean, one of the things I'm a little bit kind of ashamed of, or I have self-doubt about, which is like, why so much focus on, this elite? Why, So, you're absolutely right. It just happens to be the object of my research interest at the moment, but I agree I'm very thirsty for more work that involves broader, and maybe I will work on, some now that, well, not now, but in the future, if it becomes possible for me to go to Syria, then I would love to do more work with different segments of the population. But thank you for bringing that up.
Do you mind me closing? Yes, please. Thank you, Zeina. Just two small questions, one about space and one about time. The extent to which some of the struggles here that are playing out, kind of struggles over the reterritorialization of particular meanings that maybe have kind of crystallized in diaspora settings over the past 14, 15 years. But were perhaps existing in Syria before that, or kind of, but and one about time in terms of the temporality of some of these discussions, both in the extent to which kind of history is mobilized or kind of absent from the discourses, kind of, you know, the sense of what, you know, the Ba'ath's history, but also the pre-Ba'ath and Mandate years. And also temporality, I was really struck by the Azmeh quote, kind of the kind of time as the other, and kind of the ways in which, in a very kind of classical Orientalist way, Islam is kind of seen as out of time, or kind of, you know, it's not contemporary, to use his words.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. No, yeah, great questions. I mean, in terms of geography, I touch upon this a little bit in my in the upcoming book. Their presence within a different geography certainly did have an influence on their discourse. If anything, just by kind of what they valorize as critical distance, but really it's distance from somewhere. So I don't know if it's just critical distance or a specific vantage point. And in one of the chapters, I argue that it actually is a specific vantage point. With regards to temporality, I mean, Assadist Al Azmeh is particularly kind of, he's a historian, so certainly in all of everything that he's said or interviewed or published since the fall of the regime, there is a strong presence for history. Maybe not so much the other, but Burhan Ghalioun also has a strong historical component. Yassin Haj Saleh too, some less than others, naturally. But Aziz is very well known for being kind of unabashedly I don't want to call him anti-Islam, but maybe almost, anti-Salafist, let's say, to be fair to him, but also in a quite a passionate and strong, very secularist way. To what extent this has to do with his relationship with time versus geography, as you said, the spatial, the fact that he teaches at the Open University, Vienna, I mean, he was in London, in SOAS, I think, earlier. So I think it's both. But I agree with you that his views are not very nuanced in relation to Islam and political Islam in particular.
Question actually about the culture and geopolitics and how we might think about gender and the nation within it.
Yeah.
Okay? Where is the question of the nation and the gendering of the nation coming in? The cultural influence, the Islamic influence, but also with the geopolitical influence, the minister who's there with the woman, but also that women are right in the constitution.
Yeah. It's quite at the forefront of discussions, actually. There were serious critiques, not just by feminists, but by general activists about the absence of women in the appointments. So when they first took power, they made some appointments, none of which ministers, none of which were women. And then in response, they appointed a woman to Office of Women's Affairs, and women went nuts. I mean, the social media exploded with ridicule and criticism, and she did this interview where she said, she kind of valorized the women. Traditional roles for women, that women will have a great role. She did say that, will have a great role within the new Syria, but of course that women will always remember her priorities in the home or something like that. And again, she got huge backlash. The recent, I don't know if you've seen the attendance of the foreign minister of the interim government in Davos. He was asked, Tony Blair asked him about women, and he said that they will take an important role. There have been some appointments since, non-ministerial, but there have been, the head of the central bank is a very capable woman. There have been a couple of heads of hospitals, etc., by appointment again. So I think they're aware, they have a sense of kind of the vibe on the street and trying to respond to it. To what extent this is authentic remains under question. Is it just a political tool to get into power officially and in a more legitimate way? Is it genuine belief in, I wouldn't say gender equality, but that women should have a strong role? It's not clear yet, but it's certainly at the forefront of current debates.
Yes.
Thank you. Building on Andrew's question about space and you answered with what critical discourse actually means in terms of critical vis-a-vis what. I was wondering if you considered meaning as praxis to kind of step away from the major problem that we have with approaching meaning, that is that meaning is mediated through language. So in a way, we have to go to meaning through discourse. And I was wondering, building on what Andrew said about the fact that these intellectuals have lived in a different geography for many, many years, if the question of praxis could maybe help us bridge this gap between, I mean, language as not just being linguistic meaning, but just like in every single definition of meaning, we have to approach it through language. So yeah, just wondering.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, on the second question, I want to clarify. I do think their presence in exile has influenced their vantage point, but I'm not. There are millions of Syrians that relate to this discourse. It's not alien to the society. It's very much, and these people, even in all these years, I mean, some of the participants in my study who are in Germany haven't even learned German. They're very much still entrenched within like an intellectual, an Arabic-speaking Syrian intellectual milieu. So I don't think it's like they've become alien from, at least a segment of the Syrian society, certainly not all of it, but a significant segment of the Syrian society. The first question, I think, but all three kinds of meaning, other than the linguistic one, are about praxis. I mean, when you talk about existential meaning, it's, all of these questions are about, how do we guarantee that people have some choice in, determining their environment, so political power, whether through a democratic process, to what extent will, for example, the Constitution or other frameworks that organize society enable people to have agency, i.e. existential meaning. So I think with the exception of linguistic meaning, I hope I didn't misunderstand the question.
No, what I meant is, like for example, in the meaning as essence, for example, you say that Yusuf Saleh says that it's but like the very idea of if this is praxis, it's mediated through language. So karama, like we still need language to communicate whatever it is. So the question of language is still there.
Yeah, I think language is central even within praxis. I mean, you need language to make things happen. Is it reduced to language? For many of these, at least for some, the ones that come to my mind, no. There are very much activists on the ground who went on protest, continue to act and be on the ground and have conferences and stop in front of government institutions with banners, or they're very much engaged as activists too. Especially now, almost all of them, which makes me very jealous, have already been able to go back and have done some form of activism on the ground. So it's not just within language. Many of them are. Burhan Ghalion was the head of the first president of the National Council of the Syrian Opposition. They're very involved in praxis as well as kind of language. So yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much. That was amazing, as always. And so I was curious if you have any insights on what sort of structures will remain in this new political setting. Thinking of just like,
Political structures, or?
I guess there will be always the classic like traditional like family structures and like that. I was gonna say, but I'm thinking more like, political structures.
Yeah, I mean that's the 100-pound question. We don't know yet. I think there's a real threat that the promises that were made will not materialize for one or the other reason, or at least there's fear. I don't know if it's a legitimate fear. Many Syrians shape it. As I said, over the past month, discourse has moved significantly, visibly within 1 month from like excitement and optimism and hope to what exactly is going on? So there is a chance that these structures will be significantly altered by the desire for what the leaders in this de facto government are calling a different kind of state. Different how? Can you tell us more? So it's unclear. But yeah, there's certainly that concern. There's one certainly good thing, which is a huge injustice. A brutal regime has been removed. Huge vacuum, depends what comes in for us to find out really what the structures that you talk about are going to look like, but I don't have an answer yet. We're waiting. Thank you.
So I have time for maybe a couple more questions, if we have any. Yeah, okay, so Ned and then Michelle, yeah.
Just, and it's interesting you mentioned interviewing intellectuals in Germany, for example. One of the things that's happened is that many Germans on the far right have become very excited about the idea that Syrians will now leave Germany, right? And that's happening across Europe as well, and even in the US. So this is, I know, not the topic of your research.
That's okay.
But how are your interlocutors or people you're speaking to talking about the kind of mark that the Syrian diaspora will leave behind in the places where Syrian exiles were?
I have to say it hasn't been the focus of their discourse. I know that there's been some some kind of, maybe narcissistic celebration of the announcements of the Minister of Health in Germany that it will create a crisis if all the Syrians moved, because they constitute 6,000 doctors in the healthcare force. So there's this sense that, people should have a choice. There's an emergence of, you'll get both voices, but like on social media, for example, there's people who will celebrate, wherever we've gone. There's been a beautiful kind of social media campaign in Egypt, not so much in Europe, but in Egypt, with Egyptians like saying, we won't let you go, you have to stay, the food is great and whatnot. So there's been some, cute gestures here and there on social media. In Germany, there's also this sense that they contributed to kind of enriching the culture, but usually the focus is on food. The professions. But yeah, that's a good point. From a European politics perspective, it would be really cool to kind of campaign or maybe become more vocal about what may be lost when these people leave.
Yes, because also many Syrians obviously would rather choose to remain, and so that's also.
Some will, some won't. It really also depends, and that's why it's in Europe's interest to, to allow the creation of what a poet in Arabic would translate to a life that resembles life. If we are able to create a life that resembles life, I think a lot of Syrians will return. They've been streaming. You could say maybe there's a just visits, I don't know, but I think there's a genuine desire to return if life is livable.
So thank you very much, Zeina. It was really, really amazing presentation and so much emotion and shifting of
Yeah, sorry.
I have a question related to justice, because of course the quest for justice is so central in transitional societies.
Yeah.
I know it's also not your primary focus, but how are they framing justice? Is it more like a punitive thing, a restorative thing, and the role of religion also that is playing in this quest for justice?
Yeah, great question. It takes hours, and I know people are ready to leave, but I'm going to try to summarize. There are several things happening on that front. There's demands for transitional justice and accountability amongst, like I mentioned. There is maybe a bit of negligence on the part of, or at least no prioritization of that agenda on the part of the powers. As a result, in some areas, there have been incidents of a lot of concern, including ones that have a sectarian or religious dimension within them. So that's why it's doubly important that these legal channels are, made visible to people and reassured that their desire for justice does not need to be taken in their own hands, kind of thing. But like I said, the official statements have been unsatisfactory so far. It's ambiguous as to why. I'm not sure. There are some conspiracy theories, then there are other theories, but it's unclear why this agenda has not been prioritized. And there is a real risk that if it isn't, things will digress towards vengeful / sectarian flavored violence, like, yeah.
I think we can squeeze in one more question if anyone has any questions, or should we?
So, I mean, in one of the quotes, there was something around the patterns, the existing patterns, and I'm thinking a little bit of not only language, but also what do you think is the risk that whoever is governing is at some point going to fall into the same patterns for governing, the same patterns of control, and then when it comes to language, you could see the same pattern of language, but just, you know, exchanging one term for the other, and then now that's the new Syria, and, you know, you have the same patterns just because, as you said, because it's been so entrenched culturally. So, and sometimes, and I'm thinking of other places also in the region, there is sometimes an underlying belief that, you know, this is how it is, this is what works here, this is how history has been, what how history taught us, and yeah, and then you fall into just the same kind of sort of an oppressive mode of governance, just with a different face. So
Yeah, I mean, that's the threat. That's why all these people are organizing and creating parties and meetings and protests, because they're genuinely scared that it'll just be the removal of an ideology, replacement of one ideology with another, same patterns of oppression, same instruments. Exactly the same instruments, I think, is impossible, because there's been too much blood that has been, you know, sacrificed to for example, political imprisonment, I think, is a red line. Who knows? I don't want to predict too much into the future. I'm always reluctant, but it seems that those are things that have actually become taboo within Syrian culture. People will not tolerate those things. But there will be other patterns of oppression, maybe more subtle or more kind of disguised behind different types of authority, spiritual and otherwise, that might recreate similar power structures under the name of a different ideology. And that's exactly what all these, you know, people are trying to resist.
Thank you very much, Zeina.